Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking out your Friday afternoon to come and join us, particularly at the end of a semester. And fall semesters seem to be getting more and more grueling every year. I'm Stefano Giordano's. I'm the director of the Remarque Institute, and I'm going to try and start us up with the intensity appropriate to the subject. Emily Wilson's introduction to the Iliad, welcome Emily to Remarque, like her translation, attends in great detail to the corporeal qualities of the book, to the suffering in the morning, the hierarchies and violence, and the short-lived claims to glory. The introduction ends like this, and forgive me for reading for a second straight out. In its attentiveness to the visual, as well as the auditory qualities of the world, this is Emily, the Iliad can feel entirely at home in our own image-focused media landscape. 21st century readers and listeners may see the inequalities of the poem's social worlds with particular clarity. The emotional intensity of the poem's representation of conflict feels in tune with the anguish and partisanship of our era. We are now, she continues, in a period of crisis, not for a specific nation, but for humanity, inhabiting a planet that is becoming less and less habitable. A new kind of heartbreak can be felt in the Iliad's representation of a city in its last days, of triumphs and defeats and struggles and speeches that take place in a city that will soon be burned to the ground, in a landscape that will soon be flooded by all the rivers, in a world where soon no people will live at all, and there will be no more stories and no more names. And she goes on and concludes with, you already know the story. You will die. Everyone you love will also die. You will lose them forever. You will be sad and angry. You will weep. You will bargain, you will make demands, you will beg, you will pray, it will make no difference. Nothing you can do will bring them back. You know this. Your knowing changes nothing. This poem will make you understand this unfathomable truth again and again, as if for the first time. Now that seems to me to set the appropriate tone, and it speaks to the immense literary sensibility that Emily Wilson has put into this work. This is probably the single most famous translation of our day, or maybe the second, after Emily's translation of the Odyssey made so many waves in 2018. At the time, I read it to my daughter, then 6 years old, and now she's reading the Iliad by herself, which I say not to embarrass her, I promised I wouldn't, but because it speaks to the force and movement of Emily Wilson's rendition, the importance of her use of iambic pentameter as a way of capturing a rhythm and negotiating the voices of Homer, the characters these voices make, the written, spoken, and also deeply felt texture of the text. Now, if you're here, you don't need me to give the classic introduction, and so I've ignored it so far, but I briefly will say the basics. Emily Wilson, first to my left, is a professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's a MacArthur Fellow, a former Guggenheim Fellow, and a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome. She has translated Euripides and Seneca, and is the author of 3 books which clearly inform her thinking here as well. Mocked with Death, Tragic Overliving from Sophocles to Milton, The Death of Socrates, Hero, Villain, Chatterbox, and Saint, The Greatest Empire, A Life of Seneca. I mention these because I wouldn't want these to disappear into the translation, but they should sort of speak to one another in many ways. It's also unfair to say 3 books because the introductions to the Iliad and the Odyssey are fully fledged books of their own. To present further, so first we will have Emily speak a little on her work, and then to discuss with her we have Emily Greenwood, second to my left, and Brooke Holmes to end of the front table. Emily Greenwood is professor of classics and comparative literature at Harvard, and she has also taught at Yale and at Princeton. She's the author of 2 books, Afro-Greeks, Dialogues Between Anglophone Caribbean Literature and Classics in the 20th Century, which won the 2011 Runciman Award, and Thucydides and the Shaping of History from 2006. She has co-edited several projects on the reception and reuse of Greek and Roman texts and histories, and in her current work, she is very invested in the moral and political meanings of the classical past, including in American histories. Brooke Holmes is the Susan Dodd Brown Professor of Classics at Princeton, a former Guggenheim Fellow as well. She is the author of The Symptom and the Subject, and also of Gender, Antiquity, and Its Legacy. Her current project is titled, or rather was titled as of the time of the website posted somewhere online. I really love this title, so I keep it anyway. The Tissue of the World, sympathy, life, and nature in the ancient Mediterranean. And also, before signing off, I want to thank Lauren, Bessie, Sam, Paul, and Amy Nguyen for preparing this today with me. Please join me in welcoming our speakers today.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for having me, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to Brooke and Emily in advance for talking to me and about me. So I'm gonna start just by reading the beginning of the Iliad, first in Greek and then in my translation, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about my approach, and then I'm going to do another tiny reading and then pass it on. Menin aida thea pelea do Achilleos ulomanen hemuria kaios alge etheka polas diftimus psukasa idi proiapsin hero on autuste heloria curious. Sorry, sorry. Heloria tuke kunesin oio noisita daita dios te teleto bula exudeta prota diasteten erisanta atretes ten axandron kai dios Achilles. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, that caused the Greeks immeasurable pain and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades and made men the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds. And so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles. Sorry, I'm kind of messed up in the middle there. Okay, so I thought I'm just supposed to talk for 10 minutes, so I thought I would just at first emphasize maybe just to think about my work as, I think, informed by several ways that I'm from two different worlds. And of course, translation is a bridging of multiple worlds inherently. As you can hear, I grew up in the UK, so I spent half my life in the UK. I did classics at Oxford and then another degree there, and then I came to the US to do my PhD work. I think the fact that I'm aware of classical studies and the reception of Homer and the ways that people encounter Homer, both in the original and in translation, in these two different cultural and academic environments, has been important for my work as a translator. Partly because I think people who've grown up in the US tend to have much more reverence for the quasi-canonical 20th century American free verse translations of Homer. And it was startling to me to realize in what great reverence American readers might hold Richmond Latimer or Robert Fagles. And of course, I didn't go to 9th grade and be told this is the Homer that you must bow down before, because I didn't grow up in that educational system. So I think I was sort of seen as more iconoclastic within an American system than I might have been elsewhere. But then also, on the other hand, if I'd stuck in the UK, I think I wouldn't have quite realized the importance that a new translation of Homer could have, given that there are so many more students in the US who read Homer in translation and take the study of Homer in translation seriously. I think it's, so that's one way that I'm sort of from two worlds. Another way is that I have a degree in English literature as well as degrees in classics and comp lit. I think the fact that I really care about the long tradition of Anglophone metrical poetry is essential for how I'm approaching the task of, in a way, writing, in a way, it sounds terrible to say it, but it's like writing new English epics. The focus on meter and sound and caring about the English language and trying to hint at this is a language and a poetic tradition that has a long history is essential to my work as a translator of Homer and other ancient poets. I think if you're either from a purely Anglophone tradition or from a purely classical studies discipline, it can be harder to take seriously both parts of the work, both the immersion in the original and the work of shaping something out of the English language that pays heed to the value of that language and that tradition. In my, thank you for mentioning my other work that's not translation work. In my other work that's not translation work, I was already very interested, and I've been consistently interested in the long history of reception of classical studies. and of ancient literature and philosophy. And that interest, in a way, it's been exciting to me to get to participate in that tradition as a translator. But I was already interested in it as a historical and, in a way, conceptual problem of how does ancient literature and ancient ideas, how do those things get transformed in later cultural and historical periods? And maybe a sort of final doubleness is that I've been in academia for a long time, but I've also always been interested in public-facing kinds of work. I've written for semi-popular literary press kinds of publications for most of my life whenever I've had the chance to do so. And so I think that's also part of where I'm coming from, is that I'm interested in talking both to fellow academics, fellow classicists, fellow sort of literature professors, but also to people who might be outside the academy. And I think translation has been a wonderful gift in allowing me to have those dialogues, both with my colleagues and with people who might be colleagues as translators or colleagues who are working as journalists or something completely different. I didn't think I was going to be a translator when I grew up. When I first started my academic career, I thought I would just keep on writing about the history of classical literature, ancient philosophy, its receptions. And I've been excited to realize how many of the things I'm interested in translation allows me to do. I started out as a translator when I was approached by Oxford World's Classics to do new translations of Seneca's tragedies. And I realized through doing that just how much fun it was and how interesting it was to try and figure out how to create an English verse style that might have some kind of correspondence to the wonderfully melodramatic and bombastic verse style of Seneca's Latin. I think it's important to, many people know me only as a translator of Homer. So I just want to emphasize that Homer isn't where I started. I've always loved Homer, but that wasn't the first translation project I did. And I'm really interested in translation, partly because it allows one to be in multiple different disguises as a writer. And I think part of the purpose of being a translator is to try to work out how to be a chameleon, how to write differently when you're pretending to be Seneca versus when you're pretending to be Sophocles or Euripides or Homer. I think I've sometimes been presented as obsessed with trying to make everything very clear at all times, or non-bombastic. I love bombast, and it was great doing the Seneca because it allowed me to pull out some rhetorical stops and try to write in a very purple, bombastic way. I didn't think that was what I wanted to do with Homer, because I don't think the Homeric poems sound like that exactly. Homer shouldn't sound like Seneca in English, and I think some translations make Homer sound more Senecan than I think Homeric verse actually sounds. So I was, as maybe part of my interest in different ways that that ancient literature can be presented, I signed on years and years ago to be an editor on the Norton Anthology of World Literature, and through that I got to know editors at Norton who turned out many years later to be looking for a new translation of the Odyssey. So that's sort of part of the origin story of how I did that. I wasn't sure at first whether I wanted to do it, because I wasn't sure if there was something new to do in the landscape of Homeric translation. And I didn't think it was worth spending 5 or 6 years laboring over something that would just reinvent the wheel. So then I sort of took some time out to try to experiment with how I might do it and to think through, what do the existing translations offer? Is there room for something that might do something different? And after doing that, I thought maybe there is room for something different. One of the primary reasons is that the vast majority of 20th and 21st century translations of the Homeric poems are non-metrical. And that seemed to be such a huge thing that's missing for the general reader or the student if you're not hearing there's a regular beat all the time in this poetic narrative. I also felt that there were ways that the existing translations were focalizing through a single point of view in a way that wasn't reflecting the developments in Homeric scholarship, which have shown how subtle and sophisticated the flexibility of Homeric narrative perspective is, that we're always shifting around and the voices in Homer don't all sound the same. So I felt there maybe are ways that I can do something different. So I'm just going to say I'm trying not to go on too long. I feel like I'm going on too long, but I have a couple more things to say. I've been interested in watching the reception of my work, and I was going to note two main trends in the headlines, both of which I think are kind of misleading. One is the headline that was always there for the Odyssey, which was Emily Wilson is a woman. I'm not sure how much that has to do with my work, and we can talk about it. And the other is Emily Wilson is a modernizer, which has been the headline for the Iliad. Again, I'm not sure how much that has to do with my work. I think writing in iambic pentameter isn't an obviously modernizing gesture. So in terms of the headlines that I would do, which none of which are any good as headlines, so I get why they're not used. One is iambic pentameter using meter. I mean, of course, people are not going to write a headline that says iambic pentameter is really cool still, but I do think it's really cool still. And I do think that paying attention to sound, including alliteration and assonance, as well as meter, has been essential to what I'm doing all day when I'm wrestling with writing these translations. Another is focusing on point of view and the flexibility of point of view in Homer, and trying to feel my way into what I think the Homeric poems themselves have, which is deep empathy for all the characters, including the inanimate and animal characters, including the horses and the dogs and the spears. Clarity, I think the Homeric poems are, in contrast to some other ancient poets. If I was translating Homer, I wouldn't think clarity. If I was translating Pindar, I wouldn't think clarity is the first thing you have to get across. If I'm translating Homer, I do think clarity is essential, because Homeric syntax is so clear, and these poems are designed for oral performance and for comprehension out loud, rather than you need to study the footnote to figure out what that sentence just said. Clarity, including clarity about narrative, clarity also about social relationships between people and about feelings. I'm also interested in paying attention all the time to metaphor, and that includes alien metaphors, like the unfolding of the limbs in death, which is not the way we may think about the body. I'm aiming, if possible, for a diction and a register that's not too chatty. I think some translations import a whole lot of colloquialisms and borderline cliches, and I don't want to do too much of that. I want to, even beyond the use of regular meter, I want to have a register that feels very recognizably like real speech, but not quite real speech. So no contractions, and the register should feel very human and very direct and rapid and clear, but not necessarily full of slangy stuff, which I think is a difficult balance to draw. I want to pay attention to variety of tone, that the Homeric poems aren't all one note. They can be funny as well as dark and upsetting and tragic. And I also wanted to pay attention to pacing. I think some translations of Homer and of other texts too tend to be much more long-winded than the original, because there's never a single way to translate any one word or phrase. I wanted to invite the reader to be thinking about performance out loud and to want to read out loud. In turning from the Odyssey to the Iliad, I felt there were a whole lot of extra challenges, which maybe we can talk about. I mean, one is there are far more names in the Iliad, and names really matter in this poem because, of course, people die for a name, and men in this poem are connected to each other through the names of their fathers and their comrades. Partly as a result of that, I gave up on doing line for line, which I actually think had a really good effect on the eration of the verse in the Iliad versus the Odyssey. There's a different kind of emotional intensity in the Iliad. I mean, it's the amps are always going up to 11 in the Iliad in a way that sometimes happens in the Odyssey, but it's not. That level of total claustrophobia and intensity is greater with the Iliad. There's also a far more developed divine cast, so thinking through how to make the divine characters feel fully real, even though the reader is likely not to come to the poem with a faith in Poseidon. That was challenging too. There were challenges about the intense rhetoric and how to make these very, very angry speeches sound really intense and not too funny. Sometimes funny, but not always ridiculous. And then also the sequences of killing, where, of course, Odyssey Book 22, you have a sequence of killing, but in the Iliad, so many sequences of massacre. The reader has to still be on the edge of their seat, even if you've listened through already many hours of massacre, you still really need to feel it every single time someone dies. So I'm just going to end by reading another tiny, tiny passage, which I think is a sort of symptomatic of a very Iliadic passage. This is where the fighting breaks out in book 4. And then I'm going to stop there. Once they were gathered in a single place, they clashed together, shields of leather, spears, bronze-armored bodies, and fierce human will. Their shields collided, and the metal bosses clanged in cacophony. On every side, men shouted out in agony and triumph, killing and being killed. The earth was flooded with blood, as when from 2 opposing mountains, from mighty springs, 2 river torrents, swollen by winter storms, flow down the deep ravines, then clash, collide, and mingle in the gorge, creating an enormous flood. The shepherd, high on the hilltop, hears the waters roar. Such was the noise of fighting and of screaming as those 2 armies met.
So over to another British Emily. Thank you for letting us into something of your ongoing thought about translation and the sort of translations that you did before coming to Homer. I really want to start with how I've imagined and thought of you in your translator's workshop at your desk all these years. For me, the highlight of this past summer was getting an advance copy of Professor Wilson. I'll call you Professor Wilson just once, and then Emily, which is not, after all, such a bad name. Getting an advance review copy of Professor Wilson's Iliad. But when it actually came through the post, I couldn't open it. I looked at it and I circled round it, and I was nervous because of the weight of expectation. I didn't write this translation, but I was still nervous. The weight of expectation of bringing a new Iliad into the world. I thought of the noise of all the chorus of translators who must have been in your head, your back, Chapman, Pope, Fitzgerald, Fagles, Lombardo, and on and on. And all of this for 6 years. Was it 6 years
Yes.
that you worked on this translation? And I also thought of all the endless debates about translating while female, which you've alluded to, that surrounded your translation of the Odyssey. And I also thought of Sophie Collins, a brilliant poet and translator who's written brilliantly about the power dynamics of translation, and also how translation is regulated and feelings of shame are inculcated by reviewers and translators around rigid notions of fidelity. And I just found it overwhelming, even though I wasn't the translator. I mean, of course, all academic work is like this. We all hear voices in our heads, and sometimes they gang up on us. But I think as a form of literary, creative, intellectual work, translation has it harder than any other kind. Most of all, I thought of the precedent of your Odyssey, and I thought, how are you going to do that again? Do it as brilliantly, but differently for the Iliad. Of course, when I opened the covers, within a page, I was fixated. And I thought, okay, phew, fine, we're okay. So I want to frame my remarks today with the idea of the Iliad that is in the water versus the Iliad that is in our hands. There's a lot of hype, as Emily's already mentioned, that attends any new translation of Homer. The idea that Homer is being resuscitated, that we have a 21st century Homer that is our Homer, that we have a lifeline to epic, a lifeline to antiquity, that we're staking our place in the relay. And people have strong opinions. The people have strong opinions. This is not anything that academia has a monopoly on. Then there are the characters, the Achilles, the Hector, Priam, Helen, the gods, the whole mythical drama. I'll call this the Iliad that is in our water. And I take this phrasing from the great playwright, Susan Laurie Parks, who in fielding questions about the relationship between her play cycle, Father Comes Home for the War, which was staged in 2015, and Homer's Odyssey, subtly pushed back, Father Comes Home for the War, is a quasi-American Odyssey in the Civil War. To quote Parks, "My dad, Donald Parks, was a career army officer. He joined the Army ROTC in college. It was one of the few places in this country where an African-American person could join, get a job, and have some kind of guarantee of fair treatment. To become a colonel in the army from where he grew up in Chicago was a big deal. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and the Bronze Star was the big medal that he got. Father Comes Home from the Wars is inspired by my dad. It was not inspired by the Odyssey. The Odyssey is in our drinking water. So you get bits and pieces and shards and shrapnel of a lot of things. The Odyssey is a big thing you get. It's a big thing people latch onto and think I'm doing a retelling of the Odyssey. No, I'm not. That's not where I'm coming from. It's Star Wars. It's Ulysses S. Grant. Perhaps the Iliad is less in our drinking water in the US or anywhere in the world than the Odyssey is. Instead, it's like the outdoor tap that freezes in the winter and thaws again whenever we need to talk and think about war. Or we think about the shock of Priam grasping Achilles' knees in Iliad 24, whenever we think about inexorable peace and receding dreams of reconciliation, which of course are very much with us today. These scenes or postcards from the Iliad have given us stunning pieces of works of art, but they are the Iliad that is in the water. When you try to close your hand on them, they slip through. The Iliad that is in your hands, by contrast, is the one that you can hold onto, that you can scrutinize and come back to. It's solid. And for it to be in our hands as a readership, it needs to be translated. It doesn't matter if you can read Homeric Greek. I've been studying, teaching, thinking, writing about ancient Greek for 30 years, but I have not lived my life in ancient Greek. I find it utterly engrossing, and dialogues with these works will always structure my thought, but it's not native to me. Homeric Greek dialect is not my native language, and it's not anyone's native language for that matter. I'll always read it more haltingly than English. To have a translation that breathes and flows, that makes me sit down and read the Iliad all the way through in just 1 or 2 sittings, is an event. Homer's Iliad in Greek, I always remember whenever I read it in Greek, is not for me. I'm not within the horizon of the audiences imagined in the past by the author function, which we refer to as Homer, and by the bards that perform this poem. When I read Homer's Iliad in Greek, I'm also not reading the original work. I'm reading an edition that stands in a long train of modern editors, reaching back to grammarians, scholars, and editors in antiquity, reaching back to Homer's ancient readers, and Homer as an author function for a rich oral-derived tradition. By contrast, Emily Wilson's Iliad is an original work. In her book, Literary Translation and the Making of Originals, the translator and translation theorist Karen Ehrenreich writes, "Translation has no truck with modest changes. The entire translation is a text that didn't exist before. All the words are added, all the words are different." I love that quotation, but I also think in thinking about the Iliad in English, it's not the case that all the words are different, because there are deep pathways of translation within the Iliad in English. When Emily translates the first line of Book 8 of Homer's Iliad as "in saffron robes, dawn spread across the world," other translators have used saffron before her: Chapman, Fitzgerald, Lombardo, Verity. These are well-worn grooves for Homer in English, inventions that bear repeating. Translations produce their own formulae and traditions in the target language, and this produces felicitous echoes when the passages being translated are themselves formulae in Homer. So this sense of double formulae in the English translation tradition and formulae in Homer. In a literal-minded way, you could just say, okay, but it's obvious. Krokopeplos, dawn with her saffron robe. Krokos in Greek just is saffron in English. But saffron works in the tradition of Homer's in English because it's a textured word which brings the senses to life. It's a dye and it's a warm, earthy spice. And we could think differently. Loose adaptations of this formula in Homer have shown that they can do Homer's language even better, not better than Emily, better than Homer. I think of Cicero complaining in his work on the best kind of translation, complaining that critics of his Latin versions of the Greek speeches of Aeschines and Demosthenes were not as good as the Greek originals. And Cicero grumblingly writing, well, let Demosthenes and Aeschines try and write in Latin, and they won't be better than me. So if I think about the English tradition of Homer, I think of Christopher Logue's version of what you do with Heos Krokopeplos, dawn with her saffron robe. robes. And this is how Christopher Loeb did it in Pax, his installment of his versions of Homer, published in 1967. Rat, pearl, onion, honey. These colors come before the dawn, lifted above the ocean, bringing light alike to mortals and immortals. Lowe gives us the time-lapse of dawn with an ingressive color palette, the smudgy gray of early dawn, the rat, the translucent glow of pearl and onion through to the viscous honey when dawn floods the horizon. If Homer wrote in English, he wouldn't surpass that. So that's the strong audacity of translation, to say this is how this work lives in English. I love Emily's instinct for knowing when to turn the dial, knowing when to naturalize or domesticate the Iliad, drawing on the full repertoire of English poetry and of the prehistory of the Iliad in English, what we might call the traditional language, and when to defamiliarize it, jolting readers out of our too comfortable ideas about what we think the poem says and how it says it, and how the translator might go about arousing similar curiosity and complexity in the minds of readers reading an English version of the poem. We could call it the strangeness style, and I think you've got the strangeness style nailed. The best example, of course, and it's the one that everyone talks about, the one that I talked about in my review, is, of course, the fifth word of your translation, cataclysmic, as a translation of Ulamenen. Reacting against the traditional idea that translations strive to capture the stable meaning of an original work, Karen Emmerich proposes the arresting formula that, and I quote, translation may be conceived of as a form of translingual editing. The translator, scholar, and essayist Kate Briggs, who's written a book-length essay on translation entitled This Little Art, writes of the translator, and I quote, as a critical producer of relations, while Larry Venuti, the translation theorist, has written of the translator as a cultural go-between. Thank you for producing a translation of the Iliad that not just gives us an English Iliad to come back to again and again, an Iliad that's in the hand rather than in the water. And I think the problem of the postcards from the Iliad and excerpts and adaptations, which I love and I teach with all the time, is that when you begin to try and do serious cultural interpretive work and you say, okay, let's take the scene between Priam and Achilles in book 24 of the Iliad, you're reading it out of the context of a larger work in the whole. And so you have no complex poetic structure or moral architecture to say, how does the scene work? How is it interlocked as part of a more complex whole? So my question, if I can reserve a question when we open it up to questions, is we're teaching from and through your Iliad and your Odyssey translation, but we're also teaching you as a translator. Are you keeping archives? Are there diaries, logbooks that we'll be able to study at some point? Okay, I know, I can't monopolize it. That's my question that I'll put on hold. Over to Brooke.
Wow. Well, it's a great pleasure to be in conversation today with two of the most brilliant classicists on the planet about a work of singular brilliance, Homer's Iliad, in Emily's really brilliant translation. The question of translation easily makes visible the question of a text in relation. It makes visible more specifically a text in intimate relation with another text. This relation is in some sense mimetic, but as Emily writes at the start of her translator's note, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on, no translation can be simply, quote, the same as an original, end quote. Perhaps you already know this, but it bears repeating because it has specific consequences for a translator. I knew from the start, Emily goes on to say, that I had to make careful decisions about which features of the Greek poem I most wanted to echo, before, she continues, finding ways to construct these echoes from these effects from scratch within the entirely different palette of the English language. So while we're sorting out the relation of an original to a translation, we also find ourselves in a relation between two figures for this relation, between an echo and between the ex nihilo. The question of a relation matters particularly because the translation of the Iliad isn't any old translation. Emily sets the scene for her discussion of the site of translation by writing, "There is nothing like the Iliad." Okay, yes, she's right. But then what can translation do? Of course, it does a lot. The challenge is to give those not reading the poem in the Greek the experience of its singularity in English. Again, it's a familiar problem in translation. But I want to use the time to think a little bit about how it connects with another instability between similarity and radical difference at the site of the Iliad. And by this, I mean a long push and pull over millennia between seeing Homer as totally strange, distant, archaic, and seeing Homer as our contemporary, and maybe just Homer as ours. That relation matters here, or the relation that matters here then is between Homer and us, whoever we think we are. Now, in the work of thinking Homer as akin and alien, I'm going to do a scholarly thing and suggest Bruno Snell's Discovery of the Mind continues to cast a long shadow. The book was published in 1946. The year before, Snell had taken up a new leadership position, the vice chancellor of the philosophical faculty in the reopened University of Hamburg, a city in ruins after the firestorm of Operation Gomorrah. It's not hard to see why the book positions its readings of classical Greek and Roman culture as the incubator for a renewed sense of European community after the horrors of World War II. It came out in English only 7 years later. It was translated by Thomas Rosenmeier, who was born and raised in Hamburg, was forced to flee Nazi Germany after surviving Kristallnacht in 1938, and arrived in the US by way of 2 internment camps in England and in Canada. Now, Snell's most enduring and controversial claim is that Homer belongs to a totally different world, not only different from us, but from the classical Greeks of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. And for Snell, this narrative is very developmentalist. It's by shedding archaic, inchoate ideas about the human and the world that the Greeks become the Greeks. Snell enacts this transition through a strategic refusal of translation in Discovery of the Mind. The first chapter on Homer is awash in not just untranslated, but untransliterated Greek in the Greek alphabet. This is philology as anthropology. By contrast, the subsequent chapters enact our entry into a classical world where we are at home, a we that for Snell is us, is we Europeans. Now, Snell's narrative has been strongly and rightly resisted, including for its teleological Eurocentrism. The counterclaim that Homer isn't strange at all has been especially consequential. In his 1989 Sather Lectures, the philosopher Bernard Williams declared with Snell, but he also had E.R. Dodds in mind, that, quote, "We are now used to thinking of the ancient Greeks as an exotic people. It's time," he said, "for a different question, a return to the Greeks, including Homer, as familiar philosophical subjects." Now, Williams's language of exoticism symptomatizes how deeply race and raciality have shaped the making of modern primitivism and its vexed relation to the Greeks as at once classical and archaic, unmodern and contemporary, inside or outside the Western tradition. And Homer amplifies these contradictions because he himself sits inside and outside a classicized antiquity. And that instability is the question, I think, of why or whether Homer is akin or alien brings its own dynamics to the question of a we that comes to the poems with the unequally born baggage of European modernity and affinities both elective and found. I've thought about Homer for many years now, and I've thought about Snell for many years now. And one can ask, just working through, where this working through is definitely interminable, these post-war dynamics of sameness and otherness, does that get in the way of being with Homer? Should it get in the way? And I don't know the answer to those questions. But coming to these questions through Emily's translation, and especially then through her translator's note, disrupted both the way that I thought about these questions that I've thought about for a long time, but also how I read the translator's note. Because it's the site of this struggle of sameness and difference. Emily writes of a desire to reproduce the effect of the original and avoid, quote, contorted unnatural, language that seems to me quite alien to the experience of the Greek. The reference being to many other modern European or English translations of Homer. At other moments, though, the alien is valuable. The desire here, as Emily articulates it, is to conserve, quote, the alien features of Homeric psychology, such as how feelings are always experienced in the body, anger, rage, and grief all well up in the chest or in the heart, and fury quickens the hands and feet. Now, I find this choice of Homeric psychology as the site of strangeness especially interesting. It was, in fact, Homeric psychology where Snell staked his claims about Homer's strangeness. When we talk about Homer's psychology, we always put psychology in scare quotes or in our heads if you read Homer, stuff on Homeric psychology, because it's pretty uncontroversial that the psyche in Homer is not the soul, it's not the mind. It's a ghost that appears only at the moment that it leaves the mouth. More controversial is Snell's claim that Homer doesn't have a concept of the living body. The word soma, later the standard word in Greek for body, appears only 8 times in both the Odyssey and the Iliad, all in cases where we're talking about a corpse. And I think Snell is right. These instances of soma all point to a corpse that has been or is imagined to be denied burial. So soma is very marked as the moment where you might not have the personhood that's recuperated through rituals of death. Now, Snell's main point is that without soul, there's no body, there's no familiar dualism. But while I reject how Snell reads this point, I'd suggest that maybe this is what's strange about Homeric psychology, not that emotions are felt in the body, but that there's no body to the place of emotion in the first place. And this difference might matter, it could matter, without being instrumentalized for a narrative of classical development. It might matter, I'm suggesting, and this is not to say this would inform the only way one would make a decision. This is my job, as I'm not the translator. But it might matter because translation choices in Homer are always entangled in Homer's place in the dynamics of kinship and alienation. Consider the choice to set aside Homer's Achaeans and Argives for the Greeks. So Greece, as Emily rightly points out, was not a collective political entity in the Bronze Age. But the original or unfamiliar terms would risk, as she writes, alienating or confusing the reader for no particularly good end that I could see. Where the original is not likely to have caused puzzlement to an ancient reader, I want the reader of the translation to feel equally at home, end quote. And this idea of feeling at home with the Argives as Greeks, as Hellenes, made me think of the start of Herodotus's histories. Herodotus here inscribes Paris's abduction of Helen and a series of other myths, the myth of Europa, the myth of Io, Europa, Medea, and then that leads directly to the war between the Greeks and the Persians. So there's a direct line between those abductions, the rape of Helen, and the war between the Greek and the Persians. But going to Herodotus, I think, invites us to ask again about what are the ends of alienation? What are the ends of smoothing out? What's at stake when we make those choices? Is there something at stake for Herodotus in turning Homer's Argives and Achaeans into the same Greeks who are fighting the Persians? Does it matter that Herodotus tells us that this is how the Persians talked about the line of continuity and causality? And how do these kinds of questions of Herodotus inform the way we ask questions about making ourselves feel at home with Homer by having him talk about Greeks rather than Argives or Achaeans, the Argives and the Achaeans who populate the Iliad in Greek? What would it look like to make ourselves at home with the Achaeans as opposed to the Greeks? What would it look like to suspend the idea that the Greeks are even who the Achaeans become? I've focused on these inflections of unrealized difference as a provocation to conversation, because these are the questions you ask in conversation. But a translation is a series of choices, and those are brave choices. And that's something I think scholars can't always appreciate. Those are choices that one makes to accomplish another end. What Emily brings out beautifully in the translator's note is exactly how these inflections always have to be weighed. These inflections of sameness and difference always have to be weighed against the goal of bringing the Iliad to life for the contemporary English reader without making it too familiar. And the idea of the vividness of Homer, I think, the vitality of Homer strikes at the heart of the negotiation of sameness and difference that manifestly informs every decision Emily is making as a translator. And I think it gets to the stakes of really importance of translation as a mode of engagement with the antiquity of Homer and at the same time the contemporaneity of Homer. For translation is nothing else, it's the work of making new communities in the present around a shared attention to Homer. The relation with an ancient past is always about the relation with other people in the present. And by making Homer lively or vivid, Emily makes a Hellenized antiquity, she makes her Hellenized Homer liquid, I would say. She's profoundly challenging an idea of classicism as rigor mortis, and that's profound and brave. I stand in awe before what Emily has done, the massive, beautiful, imaginative, precise labor of it. This work enables more people, many more people in the present to live with Homer's Iliad. It enables many people at this very moment to live with the awful spectacle in the Iliad of an annihilating rage, born of grief and a kind of an emasculated impotence and a failure to protect the thing that you loved the most in the world. It allows many people to live with the way that the Iliad reminds us of the risks of an aesthetics of violence in a culture that's addicted to an ideology of violence. And Emily stresses that very strongly in the translator's note. And for all this work, I'm very grateful.
I thought it would give you a little bit to first address things said or be able to discuss a little back and forth before we turn to audience. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. These were wonderful remarks. I wish I'd had a pen so I would have taken notes of everything. It was wonderful. I'm so grateful to both of you for taking the time both to read it and to read it so thoughtfully and to prepare these wonderful remarks. So the archive and all that kind of thing, I would feel so pretentious if I was preserving a little scrap of many different rough drafts. I mean, I do have notebooks and I've put some of them in the recycling because I'm not that kind of person. I'm not going to self-archive. I happen to remember that, but of course there's also a digital archive because of course I also went through different drafts labeled as different documents and sent different drafts to my editor at Norton. I happen to remember about the saffron robes because I initially had crocus colored because I thought I love the sound of the Greek. And I thought it's going to be better to try to echo the kappa sound of the Greek, and I can do that with crocus colored. But the editor said, totally rightly, what color are crocuses? Several different colors. So I can't do that. And that's why I came back to saffron, because I felt he's actually right. The reader needs to be able to visualize the actual color, as you can. Rats also come in several different colors. We have pet rats. Crocuses are multiple colors. Saffron is only one color. So I came back to that. But there are digital drafts, and I have made. I very often do first drafts by hand and then cross it all out and then do some more drafts. But I don't preserve every scrap because I just think it's kind of self-mythologizing in a way that I don't think I want to be. I'd rather have the words can be on water, and then the first draft was probably no good. That's why I've crossed it out.
But I mean, for workshops, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing that detail about crocus in particular. But for teaching translators, emerging translators, how to translate, to get to work with successive drafts and think about your choices and the sort of evolution of the. No,
you're right. I mean, maybe it'd be better to preserve the really awful drafts, because that actually is a sort of way of showcasing to, every translator is going to come. I mean, every writer is going to come up with some bad drafts before you come up with a better draft. So maybe that's an important thing. Yes. Yeah, I hear you. I'm also really interested in Snell and the whole Homeric body and all that kind of thing. I mean, and you outline that this absolutely impossible tension of the strange and the familiar. And I mean, translation, especially of a text from as alien a culture as the Iliad as alien and distant a poetic narrative tradition as the Iliad, it's a very intense problem. I mean, I think it's a problem that's always there for any translator, even if it's contemporary fiction or contemporary poetry, but it's there, you know, to the nth degree with Homer. I mean, I felt that just about the Homeric body, that there are ways that I'm sort of pushing what do the English terms mean. I mean, I read you the first lines where I have noble souls. We think we know what a soul is. Is it really a soul? But then I also have the men themselves. And I want that to be a sort of audible tension of how can there be the person themselves and also their soul as separate entities. And I sort of want it to be audible that probably not, most readers are not going to pause on that, but I want there to be a potential of pausing on that and puzzling over, maybe we need to rethink what we think a soul means, or maybe we need to rethink what a self is. And so I felt there were sort of multiple cases where I could do something like that, where most readers might not pause and think about it. But if you do, you might think, maybe there are multiple ways to think about the self, and maybe this poem isn't presenting what a self is, or who is Hector, and when is Hector Hector versus the body of Hector. I mean, those kinds of things I think are fascinating in the original, and I wanted the reader to have a possibility of puzzling over that a little bit, which is partly by sort of trying to make sure that there are some features of that kind of alienation that might be there in the translation. I mean, I have to admit that the whole use of Greeks as opposed to Achaeans and Danaans, I paused and thought about that quite a lot, but then I also thought, I kind of know what I'm going to do here, because Danaans is so hard to fit into the line. And the reader is going to be so fixated if I have both categories on when exactly are the Achaeans different from the Danaans and when are they not different. And most readers do not know how to say Achaeans or Danaans. Most readers are not going to look at the helpful glossary that I have. And it's just going to trip you up over and over and over when you do what I want you to do, which is read out loud. And I just thought the costs are too high for using these terms, even though in some ways I think that kind of alienation about Greece is not a nation state is just as important as the kind of alienation that is there about the Homeric body and the Homeric decision-making and motivation, but it's too difficult to evoke in a way that doesn't have too high of a cost in other things that I think are really important. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that question of you can't have both, right? Like a translation is a choice. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things that I would love to hear you talk about is how you see the relationship between your scholarship that you've worked on. I mean, you were really like a pioneering figure in reception studies, and this is an active reception. And, you know, I think rather than imagine there's a right way to do it, right? Like at every stage, the same way there are choices one makes in a translation with respect to different aims, there are choices one makes in those different modalities, depending on what affordances they give you. You know, translation is a particularly high stakes one, reception is a high stakes one, but it's not one, you know, classicists tend to do as much. And so I'm curious, like, as in your work, how you've moved between those different identities.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a great answer to that. I mean, I think in a way, having thought a great deal, you know, before I was ever a translator, about reception and about the very radical transformations that the quote unquote classical tradition has undergone. I mean, that Homer has not always meant the same thing to everybody at all times and in all places. I was deeply aware of that before approaching this project. So I think that having worked a lot on reception in a way was liberating for me, because I wasn't tempted by the sort of naivety of thinking I just translate what it means, and I'm I'm not affected by my own position in culture or my own scholarly training or my own intellectual training. I mean, obviously I knew that I was writing at a particular period and making an intervention in a particular moment of the curriculum and world history and the history of the English language, and I wasn't sort of thinking. I mean, the bit you quoted of no translation is ever the same, and this, as with the passage that you quoted of every translation is 100% different. All of the words are different. The fact that I'd worked so long on reception made me sort of not worry in quite the same way about I need to make it exactly the same, and I will do that by ignoring every element of emotional effect or sonic effect or poetic effect, and instead I will just look up all the words in the dictionary and write some ugly sentences, which I think some classicists think is the way you're supposed to do it, and that's somehow more truthful, which I don't think is more truthful. I think neither way is sort of the obvious thing to do, and there isn't the right answer. And I mean, I think it's also partly that, I mean, I think we sort of talked a little bit about how some of these things are endemic to translation in general, but I think some of them are exacerbated in classical studies, both because the texts are so much more distant from us, but also because the training in classics invite you go through this whole process of thinking, quote unquote, translation is what we do in the classroom or what we make our students do to show that they understand the original. And I think that's actually very damaging for how you think about language, because they're sort of not, that we're trained to ignore the original and write over it in a way, and sort of treat the original as this is this puzzle that we will solve, and the answer is the clunky translationese. And I think that obviously it's debatable language classroom pedagogy, and it also, I think, sort of sets classicists up for, you know, writing the kind of review where you say, she changed the word order, so that shows there's something wrong with this translation. You know.
Yeah.
I this morning I was trying to bring myself up to speed with recent reviews of the Iliad, and I was reading Graham Wood's review in the Atlantic, where, and you know, your comments are the sort of perfect antidote to that review, because you know, it's a beautifully written piece, but it sort of suggests, well, you know, we've lost the wildness, we've lost the savage barbarism and the bloodiness of the Iliad, and the Greeks are not like us. Well, we're not like our own ideal version of ourselves, and so I loved your sort of nuanced teasing apart of the sort of poles of similarity and difference, and the sort of complexity of doing that kind of cultural and intellectual history.
I mean, that also maybe also relates to Brooke's point about the sort of intertwining of the history of race and class with that narrative too, because I thought that review was so much entwined with a sort of white colonial narrative. I mean, the reviewer seemed to be sort of suggesting his own hiking through Afghanistan among people he didn't understand was the best way to understand the quote unquote barbarism of Homer, which I thought was a kind of problematic way of approach to everything.
And new.
Yeah, but it's also interestingly paradoxical, because he also said that I made Hector too much of a psychopath, which wasn't a good thing. I don't know why, because you would think that would be good.
But it's just, I remember very early in my teaching career, and I just by chance I had to go somewhere. I had to show, you know, I had to do my students in a seminar in three Greek epics. We were doing Apollonius, and I showed them two movies, Troy and Oh Brother Where Art Thou, and they all agreed that Brother Where Art Thou was a much better translation of Homer, right? And why? I mean, it was sort of, you know, I think it really invited this kind of sense of what it is an adaptation, is not a translation, obviously. It's different, but like it's a different dynamic of what it means to exercise fidelity vis-a-vis original. And the mimetic is a much more capacious faculty than certainly classical scholarship or classical pedagogy in its academic forms has allowed for. I think, you know, across a much broader canvas, it's probably always had all kinds of seeds of inventiveness within it, that I feel like you're communicating with.
I have a slightly dumber question. It's very peculiar to read. It's peculiar for me to read the Iliad, and I ended up quoting from the end of your introduction for slightly different for this reason. I mean that in reading the Odyssey, the very opening passage, you insert yourself so powerfully into that statement. It is in a way that you are the muse, and that gesture. The muse invoked by the text, the one who renders the text as it goes from there. I was wondering two things. The first is, do you feel as though you have placed yourself in the text in particular ways? And the second is, in what way, what does it mean to actually, what does it do for someone to translate these two texts? So in a way, there once was an Emily Wilson, who then was the Iliad's Emily Wilson, and then was the Emily Wilson's Iliad's Emily Wilson. And I'm very curious what kind of gesture, what happens to, for example, a literary sensibility. I ended with that passage. They started with that passage because it is so absolutely direct. And there is something of a voice breaking through there as it breaks in other texts, as though the translation itself and the person are not quite that different anymore, or they're folded onto one another. And I wanted to ask you how one thinks about that, because in a way it does speak more than whatever I would read of it, of what the person as a receiver is who has participated in this act of. I'm looking for another word for translation, or this act of mediation and reconstruction.
That's such an interesting question. I don't think I quite know how to answer it. I mean, am I the person that I am on the page? And I'm very conscious of how both the Iliad and the Odyssey demanded me to have multiple different voices and to try out multiple different voices, both within the translation itself. I mean, I have to think through, how does Achilles talk? He talks differently from Agamemnon. The way that Andromache talks has to feel very different from the way Hector talks. I mean, that's partly why it's so exciting, is that you get to do this sort of quasi-novelistic thing of thinking through how do each of these characters feel, and then how do they speak, because that's how they feel. And then also the voice of the translator's note, I felt in both cases, has to feel very different from the voice either of the translation or the voice of the introduction. The voice of the introduction has to be framed differently. I mean, I feel that it's been wonderful training to try to think through. I think my prose is better because I've written so many lines of blank verse. I mean, I think I have a different ear for rhythm. I mean, obviously reading blank verse is one thing, but then writing this much of it, I think, has trained me to think about rhythm in a totally different way. I mean, I feel both that the Emily Wilson who's the Emily Wilson Iliad or whatever, that both is me and isn't me. I mean, you've probably read the Borges little short story, Borges y Yo, and he wanders around Buenos Aires, and he has many of the same interests as I do. He has this obsession with labyrinths and watches, and yet he does it in this pretentious way that's so, he's so full of BS because he's a celebrity. And I feel the same way about Emily, quote unquote, Emily Wilson. She's out there, she seems to have stuff in common with me, but I really and it's the same thing as am I going to preserve my little notebooks? I don't know. That's what Emily Wilson would do, and I don't know, that's not me.
Give us the notebooks.
Good moment to open up for audience question. By the way, please introduce yourselves.
I'm David Denby. I write for the New Yorker. I did notice at second reading of the Odyssey what I did not notice at 19, namely the moral offensiveness of famous passage when Telemachus, who is what, 18, 19, 20 at the most, right? Decides in a particularly grisly way to kill the servant girls who have been sleeping with the suitors. I assume that they are slaves, did not have what we would call agency in the matter of how they were going to sleep with or not sleep with. And when you approach a section like that, which is so problematic too, I mean, no matter how alien you say Homer is, that, and it's a very, very different culture and so on, it's offensive. In just not just in a feminist way, but just in a normally human judgmental way. So I was just wondering how, when you approach a passage like that, what goes through your mind, what kind of guardrails do you observe or ignore?
Yeah, I mean, both the Homeric poems need content warnings, and certainly both of them depict really horrifying acts of violence and characters overstepping bounds that have sort of previously been established as, we don't do this, and then people doing this. I mean, I think the question of whether the text is morally offensive depends on how it's framed, right? I mean, I think writing about rape or depicting violence, including violence against women, isn't necessarily an evil thing to do, depending on how you do it. And it seems to me that Odyssey Book 22 gives you both the perspective of the killers and also the perspective of the people being killed. Odysseus himself tells the suitors right before he starts killing them that they've forced the enslaved women into sex. He uses the adverb biaios. So it's very explicitly in the text that it's forced, at least according to Odysseus. But how would he possibly know? But anyway, there's a narrative question about that, and there's ambiguities about it. It seemed to me that in this scene, as in pretty much every scene in Homer, we're given multiple perspectives. We're shown both this very fragile young man who wants to please his father, but then also wants to become a man himself, and the anxiety about how does Telemachus become a man. He seems to have spent a very long time not being able to be a man. He's surrounded by all these bullying people who are men, and these sort of fake brothers who are not his brothers, the suitors. And so this is his way to prove himself, is by both following his father's orders and not following his father's orders, by using a different weapon, because his father says you need to hack the life out with long swords, and he chooses a different weapon, which of course also echoes the earlier scene at the start of the poem where he shuts up Penelope. So he also shuts up these enslaved women by putting the rope around their necks and using the ship's rope. So he's like his father in so many ways. This is a but then also the simile in that passage compares the women to birds who are flying home to their homes. There's an anthropomorphizing of the birds in the simile who want to get home, who want to have a nostos, and who don't, of course, get a nostos because those birds get caught in a net. So it seems to me that that passage sort of presents you both with, this is what Telemachus is doing, we understand exactly why he's doing it, and we also don't necessarily think the narrator thinks he's gay Telemachus. I don't think the narrator who's giving us the simile shows us this is how much these women are suffering. This is what they want. They don't want to be killed.
You're suggesting a psychological interpretation, which is that he's asserting himself as a man. It's not just an act of revenge against these women who have been part of this eating of his substance that the suitors are engaged in, but he's asserting himself as a man by murdering. I mean, what's morally offensive is that it's an execution.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not even a rape, as in Ovid, with magnificent passages. It's an execution. It's a cold-blooded execution.
Well, saying it's an execution suggests he's appointed as an executioner, and that's a passage I have looked at multiple different translations of, and I think some translators sort of present him partly through how they do the epithet. Telemachus has a standard epithet, pepnumenos, and if you use that epithet as an opportunity to say wise Telemachus, and the narrator seems to be authorizing this is a person who's thought about what he's doing, what he will do after he's been dubbed as wise Telemachus will seem like this is what anyone would do to punish a criminal. And then also a lot of translators import words like sluts as what Telemachus says, these women must die because of their sexual crimes, which isn't what the Greek necessarily does. It suggests he has to get rid of them because then the house will fully belong to himself and his father. Yeah. And that's a different narrative.
I think it touches on this problem of the Iliad of how much the poem is in lockstep with the ideologies. Mm-hmm. It's glorifying and also undercutting, showing the costs of these ideologies, particularly of masculinity, particularly of patriarchal hierarchy, violence, and I wondered, when you came to the Iliad, how did that question, which you sat with a lot in the Odyssey, look different or change, given how much more violent the Iliad is?
It's extremely violent, and I think it's extremely aware both of the attractions of slaughter. I mean, the only way that you're going to win the highest accolades of glory in your society, if you're a mortal warrior man, is to kill as many people as possible, to have an Aristeia, a massacre scene. And yet the Iliad is also so deeply conscious. We end with the voices of women who are going to be enslaved and who are grieving the men who either are dead or will soon be dead because of this ideology. I think you can see that very, very visibly in the Hector and Andromache scene of Andromache pleading with Hector not to go because he fights as dangerously as he has to fight in order to win chaos and continue to be seen as the best warrior in Troy. Then he also has to be destroying his city while defending it, and that paradox of that. I mean, a sort of specific thing is that the Iliad, even more than the Odyssey, has all this language of excessive masculinity and of agenorrhea and of the agen or thumos, which is very explicitly a language that suggests pride is a masculine quality, the kind of pride that makes Hector want to be at the front at the front lines at all times, is associated etymologically with being an aner. And of course, also warriors in the Iliad are constantly telling each other, be men, be men. And when there's mockery on the battlefield, it's very often gendered mockery. It's very often your girls not real men, or your gymnasts or dancers, or qualities that count as less masculine. I mean, I thought the reader is going to be able to get that. And I played around with, should I use terms like machismo? And I thought the reader isn't going to trust me if I do that, because I think readers are very often going to sort of believe that I'm inserting something of my own supposed discomfort with the questioning of valorizing masculinity into the Iliad if I use that kind of language. And I hope that the reader can see it more clearly if I use words like pride and arrogance, which could say those are masculine, but are not explicitly masculine in quite the same way. I was conscious that in a way I'm under-translating in those terms. I mean, I could translate a lot more, with a lot more weight put on, this really is depicted as a problem of masculinity.
And, but the poems, the whole idea of the Aristea, Achilles in the middle of the best Aristea ever, or the most horrific perversion of it.
Yes, absolutely both,
it's at that point, it's the weight of the poem.
Yes, the whole poem proves the point. It's not that I need to say that in my own voice. It's here from the poem. And that the same dynamic that I talked about with Hector, that is he defending his city or is he destroying it? He's doing both. The same with Achilles, right? It's usually not a good thing to cause enormous numbers of deaths on your own side. That's not usually how you win glory. And yet that is what Achilles does, that he causes this terrible numbers of deaths, both among Persians and among Greeks. And then also, once Achilles does finally get back to fighting with his own hands, he's overstepping and overstepping and overstepping, and the river rises up and says too much, and not clog the river with corpses. Yet he keeps going.
My name is Barbara Kowalczyk. I teach in the classics department here at NYU. And I'm coming to the whole thing a little bit more as a historian. And that's also the kind of question I would like to ask. So I don't know whether it's really appropriate because I've read the Odyssey, but I've not read the Iliad yet. So I don't really know whether my question is suitable at all. It already Stephanos alluded a little bit to the substance, and also it came up a little bit in Brooke. So I'm wondering how you deal with the distinction between myth and history in your translation technique as well. The plainness and the directness of the translation obviously makes things accessible in a way that's slippage that both as scholars, but particularly the broader public, easily makes between truth and fiction, or history and fiction, is even more difficult to maintain as well. And this applies more to the Iliad in some ways than to the Odyssey. And nobody would ever think vaguely that the Odyssey is not anything other than fiction. But with the Trojan War, where the historicity is always a little bit problematic, where we still are looking for the palaces of Achilles and Menelaus and Agamemnon and so on and so forth. So I was just wondering how you dealt with this particular issue in your second translation, especially.
That's a great question. I mean, I think the translation itself can't really grapple with that question entirely. I mean, the question of should I have used Achaeans, maybe if I'm going for total historical accuracy, I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of footnotes, I have an introduction, and I sort of get it. I do a very brief sketch of some of that difficulty of the relationship between myth and history, and the fact that the Iliad is obviously based on a real place, but not actually, even if you thought this play, this epic poem that begins with the god Apollo, do I really need to emphasize that no, this is not a transcription of real life historical events? Maybe I do, and I do say that. I do say there's a gap between what the archaeological record says and what the poem says, and there's all the different issues about. I don't come up with a clear answer about the Homeric question, because I kind of think, again, both that it's unanswerable and that's not quite my job. But I was happy that both with the Odyssey and with the Iliad, the Norton people let me have multiple different maps. And with the Odyssey, I have a map that's the mythical world, as well as the maps that the historical Greek world. And similarly with the Iliad, I have a theatre of the Trojan War map, which marks all these landmarks that, of course, archaeologically you can't mark. Where is the fig tree? There was probably no fig tree, it's completely made up. And that kind of thing is there on the sort of mythical map. And it's called something like the theatre, which is trying to cue the reader in, even if you're just flipping through. There's an element of this poem that's set in a place that may look a little bit like a real place, it's not entirely a real place. It's a mythical place as much as, Earthsea or the world of the Lord of the Rings, as well as partly mapping on, as those worlds do, to historical place.
Can I press you a little bit further? I mean, my point was also a little bit about the plainness of language.
Yeah.
So obviously the exuberancy and the fantastical poetic language that we do have in the epics is also a distancing advice, a distancing device. So I was just wondering whether that is a problematic that occurred to you, that the plainer the language, the more directly, obviously, it speaks to us, and the more this kind of problematic between myth and history becomes pronounced. And I'm also saying this particularly because I consider my students, I teach Greek history, but to all sorts of students, that is the only exposure that they will ever have to Greek history. When all this kind of differentiation that also came up, obviously now in the in Brooke's and Emily's contributions, that level of differentiation is not necessarily requested or desire or whatever. Yeah. So they argue, they tend to argue with Achilles and Agamemnon as if they were real people. And yes. And so I obviously exaggerate a little bit, but nevertheless, the slippage. I'm really not so interested in stating whether it's history or not history, but it's the slippage that we do in our minds all the time, really, when thinking about the Trojan War in a literary or archaeological or in a historical fashion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I see that as just a problem about plain language. I mean, I see that as a problem of students without enough literary background. I think they need to take more literature classes if they're thinking that about the Iliad, and about thinking about narrative form and poetic form. I mean, however, if I wrote these translations in a more oldie-timey way, the characters might not feel as vivid, but would the students then think, oh, Homer was writing in the 1960s because that's how it sounds in the translation? That doesn't give you a historical sense. That just gives you a sense of alienation, which is not quite the same as a historical sense. I mean, it seems to me that there are sort of things that I could do. I mean, we talked already about themselves versus the souls. That's in a way trying to cue you into this is something specific that might be there in this text, which no modern writer would make that distinction. There might be ways that these characters, I mean, even just the question of how do these characters act, they might respond to enslaved women who've been raped by other men, we're going to hang them. Or it might be that all the weapons are alien. I mean, there are all these clues in the poem itself, which are there even more if you notice them clearly. I mean, if you see clearly, these people are enslaved, these people are commanders, these people are doing this with their spears at this moment. I think, ideally, that takes you to an alien world. It might not do it in quite the same way as if I wrote in a ye-olde way, but I don't think actually that ye-olde takes you to a real alien world. I'm not sure that fully answers.
We have two more questions. And two is Ethan, and then I think we'll see two.
Hi, I'm Sarah Arvio. I've done a new edition of the poetry of Federico Garcia Lorca, and not from Knopf in 2017. So my questions are and I have not read yet. So if these questions sound completely naive, okay? What about the language of the Iliad brought you to choose iambic pentameter? And what about the iambic pentameter is amenable to the Greek lines? That's the first part of the question. And here, a personal one. Do you work at a gallop hearing the pentameter in your lines as they rise? Or do you work out the rhythms of the lines more methodically? In other words, do you think like a composer hearing the music and transcribing that music?
Thank you for those questions. I am a pentameter. I felt that that's the only way to cue the reader into. There is a long tradition of using this meter for narrative and dramatic verse. I experimented with using longer lines. Once I realized I wasn't going to be able to stick to the same line count as the original, I thought maybe the way to go is to try to do some kind of hexameter. And I spent a long time trying to do that. And I just felt that I mean, as with so many other things, there's always a cost and a benefit to every decision that you make, especially these sort of big fundamental ones. I felt I couldn't make it, if I used a longer line, I couldn't make it feel rapid and propulsive in the way that I felt the original is, that it's sort of always inviting you to listen for the next line. And when I was trying using longer lines in English, it just always felt like, okay, this feels like it has a strong break in the middle and it feels flat, and then here's another too much end-stopped stuff. It didn't feel that maybe somebody who's technically better at writing hexameter than I am could have made it work. There's one translation I know of into a version of dactylic hexameters by Rodney Merrill, the Homeric poems, which I think kind of showcases how impossible it is. It's so weird, just as it forces him into such weird word choices as well, in order to make that very alien rhythm work. So I experimented with that alternative and felt I couldn't do it. And so I came back to pentameter, and I felt that, at least for what I'm able to do with the English language, that seemed like the solution that I could come up with that was most satisfying to me if I'm prioritizing sound and the sense of this is poetically traditional. And then the second question was about, does it come at a gallop? I mean, sometimes I'm stuck for a long time, but if it comes, it's a gallop. I mean, if I don't sort of do a prose trot and then convert it into verse. And I think through this line or this phrase, and I do all the drafts are already amateur. And then it may turn out that they have to be completely reworked, but they're always verse drafts and then another verse draft.
And that's because you have a lifetime of having read English verse, reading Shakespeare, and so on. It's just natural to write in that.
I mean, I think natural is such a difficult term, right? I mean, it's not necessarily that I was lisping my mouth between pentameter, but yeah, it's practice.
I'm Ethan Kleinberg at Wesleyan University, not a classicist or translator, so interested amateur. I want to come back to, I guess what I'll call the issue of restraint, which seems to have come up several ways. I mean, I'm not so worried or interested, the history literature question I find fascinating. I mean, we know that Homer is sort of the hypotext or referent for what eventually becomes all sorts of forms of history, Herodotus going forward. It's not really till 19th century that there's a hiving off of the more literary aspects, which leads to a kind of restraint, which I think is what makes a work that is more seemingly chaste or less glowing in its use of word choice seem to twin or appear to mimic what we now think of as the type of historical, what makes history legible as history. But the question, but in an earlier discussion, it almost was that you were suggesting that there were some words that would have been the right words you didn't want to use because they were just too on the nose or too just right there, and you're worried that was going to signal something to the reader, whether it's machismo or bravado, and that might have been the right word in a perfectly good translation, but there was something you wanted to pull back from doing. And I'm wondering about that mechanism of restraint and how much that mechanism of restraint played into the way you went at it. And if this is the case to begin with, and then the purpose or what you think it achieves in moving both the reception and your intention in the translation forward. I mean, how important is it, I guess, is the first.
That's interesting, yes. I mean, the question of what is the right word, I mean, that's a very difficult question. And is there such a thing as the right word, or is there just, this is a word that I think is going to somehow work, whatever working means. I mean, I'm thinking just in terms of sort of things that I'd pulled back from. I mean, I already mentioned machismo, and I also remember having an earlier draft I was kind of happy with, where I had, in the choral sequence, I had Agamemnon calling Achilles, "You superhero," and then I thought maybe this is overdoing it somehow. I also had various different ways of dealing with the insults to Paris, Douce Paris, and sort of how do I deal with this punning and how in your face should it be about, I ended up with Pathetic Paris, which has a sort of sonic echo, but I had gone through different possibilities about is he subpar Paris or are there ways that of course it's a fun thing to sort of try and play around with what are the possibilities. And I mean that question of what is right, what do I end up with? I mean I felt that I have really mixed feelings about this because I think sometimes, I mean again going back to this question of what are valid and less valid ways of critiquing a translation. Sometimes people say that word was really jarring, and that means I don't like the whole translation. And it can be that for some readers, if some words sort of feel like this one felt really neon colored to me, and the rest of it felt like this is all sort of normal and I'm swimming along in the waters, and then, woo, this technicolored word popped up. And I noticed that word. And if I noticed it, there must be something wrong with it. And then I sort of tend to think it's actually okay if the reader might notice some of the words, because maybe that's an interesting word. But I also think, I mean, just in terms of restraint or control, I really want to be in control of what the reader's going to notice. And there has to be a really clear payoff if I'm using a $10 word at some point or other. But whatever kind of $10 word it is, I mean, it might be that kind of $10 word this might sound a little bit more colloquial than you expect to find in Homer. It might be that it sounds less, or it might be that it sounds cataclysmic. It's not necessarily a colloquial or cliche kind of word, but I want it to be a word that really lands. So, I mean, to me, part of the point of trying to be disciplined in terms of both rhythm and meter, but also in terms of the word choices not all being totally the maximum showy effect I can have with any word, is partly just that I don't think Homeric verse sort of is full of that particular kind of effect. But also that when there are important words that I want you to notice, I want there to be enough space that you can see. That's where the emphasis is. And I think I don't think there's a sort of complete right answer or over a universal answer I can give about my practice. But
at this point, it's time to thank Emily Wilson and also Emily Greenwood.